all over the world for another session, Wednesday night live. And this class is dedicated in honor of the first wedding anniversary of Michelle and Steve Lazarus, and to the fast and complete recovery of Eleanor Lazarus, and also by Mark Belinsky, our friend, in honor of his great uncle's yahrzeit, Alter Ben Moshe, on the 23rd of Kislev, in honor of Yutas Kislev, Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus. Good. Okay. And the topic this evening is betrayal. As you see, I choose always these very calming and soothing topics that are usually not discussed by others because of the sensitive matter, or I guess the complications of any type of emotional trauma involved with these issues. But as I always point out here, above all, the Torah, Judaism, is a blueprint for life, and as such, it needs to serve and address in a very relevant and personal manner the issues that we struggle with. Unfortunately, this is not the Judaism or the Torah that many people grow up with. Even those growing up in traditional circles, in yeshivas, and studying for many years, don't necessarily relate to or identify with the Torah as a relevant message that deals with the psychological and emotional and spiritual issues that we all struggle with. At best, the Torah serves as a book of laws that tells you what the rituals are about, whether it's Shabbat or kosher or the holidays or prayers, many different laws that are, many of them very powerful and very beautiful. But to see the Torah as a blueprint, a guide that actually probes and helps us probe the inner dimensions of our psyches and our souls, is not something that is usually presented in that fashion. And definitely for people who do not grow up in a traditional or any type of Torah environment of intense study, definitely Judaism and Torah are not seen in that way. So it's not a surprise that we have such a high rate of assimilation and a high rate of fallout of many, many people not finding any relevance and interest in their own traditions. So, yes, many people connect to it out of guilt, or out of obligation, or from time to time a sense of a search. But the fact remains that it's still that most of Judaism and Torah remain quite elusive and cryptic and distant and irrelevant to most people. So I find that as a personal challenge. Firstly, in my own life, this has been my own challenge, is trying to understand and relate to Judaism in that fashion, a universal personal message. And of course, in my journeys, meeting many people, I find that to be the compelling challenge. So the focus of this class has always been precisely that: how to find a relevant message that is not just relevant, but indispensable in our journey. So of course, then it's necessary to address issues that are relevant to us, not just about analyzing the biblical verses and their commentaries, but actually addressing personal issues in our lives. And if you really look closely, or not even that closely, but if you look with those eyes, and you ask the question, like, why is this story relevant to me? It happened thousands of years ago in a different part of the world, in a different time of history, completely different type of environment, and no technology then. Everything we identify this modern age with didn't exist several thousand years ago. And if you ask the question, so why is it relevant to us? You begin to find fascinating answers, and that don't even require a lot of effort often to see their personal relevance. So as they say, Shailas Chacham Chetz Tshuva, the question of a wise person is half the answer. So if you ask the right question, you're already halfway there. So the right question is, in every detail, in every episode, every character, every part of the Torah narrative, and rituals, and customs, and the holidays, and everything about it is why. Who cares? Why is that relevant to me? That's the question. Ask that question, why should I care? Why is this relevant to me? And then you're already halfway to the answer. So even though the question sounds so skeptical and irreverent in a way, but the fact is it is the only question that will actually get you there. Questions that don't shake people up, and don't shake ourselves up, don't get you places. Because if you're still in your own comfort zone after the question, then you're going to get answers that just are where you were before. We like to look at question and answers as a form of a journey, whereas the Baal Shem Tov says that for every question he has an answer, and for every answer he has another question. So it's like climbing a mountain. As you climb the mountain and you don't go back to square one, the higher you climb, the more you see, and the more you see, the more wonder there is, and the more wonder there is, the more questions there are. So as you grow in knowledge, you actually grow also in awareness of the awe of that which is unfathomable. And the more you understand, the more you relate to, the more you realize how much more there is to understand. And that's not a statement in any way undermining or weakening the power of knowledge and awareness. On the contrary, that's what awareness truly is. It's like climbing the mountain. So you can choose to live on the bottom of the mountain or in a valley and only see your little anthill and feel very comfortable, and simply not even know that there's something bigger, and therefore not even have any tension or anxiety about that you have not that you can't contain it all. Or you can choose to climb, and when you choose to climb, there is a risk. The risk is you're going to see a lot more, and you'll see how far and how distant the universe is, and how much you know. There's so much more that you don't. But that is exactly what makes a person an intelligent person. That they understand what they understand, and at the same time understand how much more there is to understand. So the question, therefore, of who cares or why is this relevant to me is critical in the process. So here we have the story in this week's chapter, and I'll show you the process. I'll demonstrate it right here, right now, how this is done with using this chapter as an example. So if you read the verses on the surface level, this is a study and call this a course in methodology. Okay, if you read the story on the surface level, so you begin this week's chapter, Vayeishev, and Yaakov settled in the land of his father, the land of Canaan. This is after, if you're following the story in the previous chapter, where after 20 years of spending time with Laban, he comes back to Israel, and he meets and encounters on his way his brother Esav. And last week's chapter is that encounter and their reconciliation and other details of that part of Jacob's settling. But now the story continues that Jacob now settles, Vayeishev settles in the land of his father, Eretz Canaan, which is still the name that was used before it became known as Eretz Yisrael. Later it would become Israel. But it's the same area. And then the story continues. Ela told us Yaakov, these are the chronicles on the children, this is the chronicles of Jacob, and it begins with the story with Joseph. That Joseph was 17 years old, and Royes Echav, he tended to his brothers the sheep, and he was a child of the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. These were the two handmaidens of Jacob, the wives of Jacob. And then it says, continues that Joseph brought slander, every bad tale, everything that he could bring bad about his brothers, he told his father. And the story continues, very famous stories of Joseph's dreams. And Joseph's coat, colorful coat. These have become already popular in modern cinema. And it continues on how Joseph tells the dreams to his brothers, how they get jealous. Then it continues how the sons of Jacob, Joseph's brothers, go off. They were all shepherds, so they go off to tend to their sheep and flocks in Shechem, in a particular city. And Jacob, or as he's known right now as Israel, tells Joseph, "Go ahead and please go to your brothers and go assist them." And the story continues how Joseph goes out there and begins looking for them. He meets a stranger in the field. I'm mentioning all this because I'm going to get back to it. First, I'm just, as I said, just telling you the surface narrative. If you just read it on your own, this is what it would sound like. So he meets a stranger in the field, and the stranger sees that he's wandering about. That Joseph is wandering about, and the man asks him, "What are you looking for?" And he says, "I'm looking for my brothers. My brothers I'm looking for. Do you know where they may be where they may be tending to the flocks. Anyway, finally, after a while, he finally finds them. As his brothers see him approaching, and remember, their jealousy at this point was at its peak, because they felt that he considered himself superior to them, and that in his dreams he demonstrated this type of condescension in their mind. So they plot, and they said, "Here he comes, the man of dreams," and they plot to kill him. Anyway, an ensuing the debate goes on by the brothers. Some say, "Don't kill," and bottom line is they throw him into a pit. And then they throw him into a pit, and they were going to kill him. But then they saw a caravan of nomads, Arabs, traveling by. So some of the brothers said, "You know what? Instead of killing him, let's just sell him to these nomads as a slave." And that's what they do. They sell him as a slave. And that's how Joseph ends up in Egypt. And they continue the story, which I'm not going to go into detail, which you can read on your own, because I'm not going to really address it so much in this class. I've done it in previous years. I'm going to focus more about the beginning of the story that I just read. The continuing story, just for the record, is that Joseph ends up in Egypt, and he becomes to rise in the ranks. He's appreciated by his employer, and then he ends up in prison again for another conspiracy against him. But then finally the story ends up that he interprets another set of dreams, the dreams of Pharaoh. And the next chapter talks about how Joseph rose to power to become second in command, viceroy of Egypt. And we'll address that when the time comes. So just wanted to put it in context. So when you read the story, it has a lot of intriguing details about the brothers and about Joseph and the dreams. And the many, very dramatic. And it's interesting in the context of our history. This is where we originate from. But firstly, all these questions remain haunting us. What exactly is going on here? You're talking here about the tribes. These are the founding fathers of the Jewish people. And all you hear about is continuous either murder or selling or kidnapping or attempted murder and hatred and jealousy and betrayal. And this is not an isolated incident. The same was in the previous chapter with Jacob ben Esav, and then there's Jacob ben Laban, and then there's Isaac and Ishmael, and there's Abraham and his wars. The Torah is one continuous story of hostility and discord, where nothing ends up in peace, nothing is peaceful. So that's the obvious question. But on a more important level, which I began this class tonight, is the relevance. How is this relevant to us? Why should we care? So besides the historical element, the nostalgic element, people are intrigued to just hear about history and hear what happened. What relevance does it have in our personal lives? Each of us have issues we struggle with today, yesterday, tomorrow, and so on. Big issues, small issues. We all have got our stuff around relationships, around the lack of relationships. One way or another, we've got plenty of issues at work, at home, family, friends, new friends. Decisions, as they like to say. Is that from Fiddler on the Roof or something like that? One of these. You're an expert on that?
Of course, everybody.
How often have you seen?
I've used it 20 times.
20 times, wow, good. Okay, at least you're keeping busy. When all else fails, you can always watch Fiddler on the Roof. So the relevance, the personal relevance of this entire story. And as I said, once you ask the question, you're already halfway to the answer. And halfway to the answer is, if you think about, step back a moment, and let's forget about the exact characters and where they lived. What you have here is the classic story of betrayal. Of being betrayed by your own family. Here in this case, Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. So of course there are the details and the graphic details and the gory details. But overall, bottom line is that's very relevant. All of us can ask that question. Were you ever betrayed? Now obviously, some of us feel we've been betrayed even though we haven't been. We all project and we have different ways of looking at it, and we'll discuss that. But there are true betrayals in our lives that are objectively that we've been hurt and betrayed or abandoned by people. And especially hurtful, maybe the most hurtful thing, when it comes from people that are loved ones. Because if it comes from a stranger initially doesn't have a commitment to you. So you don't have high expectations. But when you're dealing with someone that loves you, a parent, parents, siblings, people who are close to you, friends, people you trust and deserve and should trust, and there you experience betrayal, it's very deep. It affects the person because you start questioning yourself, what did I do wrong? What's the matter with me? Sometimes obviously you blame the other, but it's a very deep emotional wound. It's like someone stabbing you when it comes from a loved one. So to understand both the emotions that are evoked by a betrayal and what do we do about it is really the real story behind this whole story of Joseph and his brothers. And if you read closer with this attitude, with this look, as I said, this is a methodology, look at this in a personal way, you'll find not just that you'll find consolation because we're not the first to be betrayed, because someone already was betrayed thousands of years ago by his brothers. That's hardly a consolation. As anyone who suffered knows, it doesn't really make you feel better if other people suffer. As a matter of fact, I remember once sitting at a shiva call, God forbid, and somebody was telling the person who had just lost a parent at a pretty young age, and said, just last week someone else lost a parent who was even younger than your father. So the person who's friendly to me looks at me and says, he thinks it makes me feel better. Now it's not such a big tragedy because someone across the street lost someone. I mean, the tragedy does not console, even though misery loves company. But that's more in in the lunchroom or something like that, or at a bar, misery likes company. But when you talk about real tragedy, a person who's really suffered doesn't necessarily feel better because other people suffer. And in many ways it actually makes you feel worse because you feel like this world has a lot of suffering in it. So the story here is not just about making us feel, big thing, you're betrayed, so was Joseph. Okay, let's move on. But rather that we look at the attitude, what happened? What's the bigger story? Because the greatest thing we can learn from the people that came before us is not just that they went through what we went through. That's one half of it. The second is what they do about it. What can we learn from their behavior? For good or for bad, maybe from their mistakes that we shouldn't repeat. Or from their strengths that we can access. That's what a wise person does. That's why it's so critical to know that we are like midgets that stand on the shoulders of giants. Because when you look back and you look at someone, if you can interview someone who went through real hardship and say, what did you do? How did you manage? And you see that they came through it. There's nothing more empowering than that. As anyone knows who's gone through difficult times, the most empowering thing is meeting someone else who's gone through something difficult, and you see, and they can tell you, I've been there, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's consoling because they have credibility. It's not just someone mouthing slogans and telling you everything's going to be great. Someone that actually has gone through the fire has a credibility to others because they've been there. And you want to really know, is it, I don't know if it's a magic trick, but it's a certain power. The 12-step program, actually, which is a grassroots movement of healing, as we all know, is really based on that principle, which is really very much a Torah principle. And that is that when you're with others that are vulnerable and talk about it, it gives you, in some way, it gives you strength. It's not because, as I said, because misery likes company, but there's some strength in the group. There's some strength when you hear another person speak about something. It gives you the strength to speak. You see, number one, you're not that isolated in your misery or that lonely in your suffering. Other people are there. And then above all, you learn from others who like on the same road as you, but a mile ahead or a few years ahead, and helps you to forge a path because you can follow or learn from someone who's more experienced, unfortunately, in that particular challenge. So that's what we really look for in these stories. Is number one is to identify a common denominator to something in our own life, and number two is to look at what happened. So when you look at this, now I'm going to read the same verses, and with a more discerning and a close-up look, like with a microscope, and you'll see that there are powerful messages here, and I would even say revolutionary ones, that completely turn the whole concept on its head and has tremendous lessons to us right now, practically to each one of us. So though none of us can compare to a Joseph or to Jacob or to the tribes for that matter, yet there are still lessons that we can learn from them in our own relative to our own particular journey and challenges. So here's what it says in the verse. I'm going to read it also with an interpretation from the Baal Shem Tov, who is the founder of Hasidic movement, and also this year is his 250th yahrzeit. So here's what it says. These are the chronicles of Jacob, and it says Joseph was 17 years old. To explain, the word Joseph, Yosef, has a meaning. And you see how every word is precise here. The word Joseph means Hesafa, from the word Hesafa. Yosef means to add, or to grow. When you say Lahosif, or Mosif, or Musaf, or anything like that, you're talking about a form of growth. So the way Baal Shem Tov explains it, that when you say Yosef, the chronicles of Jacob, Joseph had grown. He'd grown out to the age of 17. 17 in the Gematria, if you heard of a Gematria, is the numerical equivalent of the word Toiv, good. The word good in Hebrew, Toiv, Tes Vav Veis, is the equivalent of 17. Tes is 9, Vav is 6, that's 15, and the Veis is 2. 15 plus 2 is 17. Yes, very good. So, this word good will later be used again, will later come up again, the last 17 years of Jacob's life, in the chapter Vayechi, the last chapter of this book of Genesis. It also says Jacob lived the last 17 years. These were the best years. So the Baal HaTurim, the commentary says 17 there too is Toiv, the good. It was the best, the best and good years of his life. So, according to this, then when you're reading this, so this whole story is really about Joseph's growth. He's come to a higher level. And then it continues. And here's a strange, if you read the verse closely, it says, Hayeroya es echav b'tzein. He tended to his brothers with sheep. What the verse is practically trying to say is that he tended to the sheep together with his brothers, or for his brothers. But then the verse should have said, Hayeroya b'tzein es echav, or Hayeroya b'tzein im echav. Here it sounds like he tended to his brothers, not to the sheep. And the sheep just seems to be almost like a additional element here in the Hebrew. So here comes a deeper interpretation. What does the word shepherd mean? And here you'll again see that if you just go a little deeper, the real story here is the story of shepherds. Because you'll see again later, he goes out to look for them as shepherds. What is the Hebrew word for a shepherd? Roya. Roya is also another word for the roya. Roya comes from the word friend. Re'echa, va'aftal re'echa kamoicha. Love your fellow as yourself. Love your friend as yourself. In Hebrew, the word for friend is re'echa, or reus. Achva v'reus, you say, friendship, fellowship. Why is a friend and a shepherd? What is the similarity between a friend and a shepherd? What a shepherd really does is tends to sheep. So besides the fact that he tends to them in the sense where he caters to their needs, makes sure they have what they need, but he also, what's the tending to a flock? To make sure the flock stays together. They can wander off, stray, and disperse, scatter all over the place. And a shepherd brings them together. He creates a form of unity. This is really what a meaning of a friend is. A friend is a person who creates unity, connects with somebody. An enemy is the antithesis. An enemy separates between people. An enemy hates the person your enemy hates. A friend is really context. If you were able to translate what a friend means, a friend is a form of closeness, a form of intimacy, closeness. There's a story that I once heard of a doctor who went to see the Rebbe, and he didn't really know why he went to see him personally. It was a friend of his suggested, a colleague of his suggested he go see him. And as he was sitting there, the Rebbe sensed that he was uncomfortable, so he said to him, I'd like to make you more comfortable. Is there any way we can? He says, I'll tell you the truth, I don't really know why I'm here. Because they told me I should come and see you, get a blessing, get advice, but I'm not really comfortable. I don't really identify with you. So the Rebbe said, look, I'm not comfortable with someone not being comfortable with me, so we don't have to sit here. There's no mitzvah that you have to sit here. But while we're here already, we might as well use the time well. And he said, do you have any questions? Or maybe you have a question that you'd like to ask me. The Rebbe said this to the doctor. So the doctor said, yeah, I'd like to know, who are you? What is a Rebbe? What's your role? Like, why do they respect you so much? So the Rebbe looked at him very calmly and said, the way I see it, a Rebbe is a friend. A friend. So the guy looked, he said, a friend? Please, is that all? I have many friends. I don't see anything so special. So what do you mean by a friend? So the Rebbe said, let me translate and explain what the word friend means, and then you tell me how many friends you have. And the Rebbe said a friend is somebody, a true friend, that you can speak to as you speak to yourself. That you trust them unconditionally, that whatever you say you will not be judged. You can be transparent, no defenses, and completely bare your soul. And then he turned to the doctor and said, so how many friends do you have that fit that definition? He said, not one. So, if you really define what a friend is, we use the word friend. I've got a lot of friends on Facebook. Okay? Facebook uses the word friend, to friend somebody. We all know that friends on Facebook don't mean anything because people that just happen to send you a friend suggestion, or I don't know, or someone else suggested it, and you friend people. I mean, I can't say I'm not friends with all these people, but I can't say I know them all. But so there's in our modern culture and social networking, friend has taken on a new definition. But in the context of the Torah, when it says a roya, someone's called a friend, it means a person who takes an initiative and makes an effort to be close, to connect, like a shepherd. And they tend to you, and you tend in return. It's a reciprocal relationship. So what the Baal Shem Tov says is that Joseph had reached a level at 17 where he lived the level of good. He'd grown to a point where he learned to be a friend. And he didn't want just to be a brother to his brothers, he wanted to be a friend to his brothers. And this is the stage that is being set in this chapter, which if you think about it, turns the whole chapter differently. When you read it, you usually think, okay, Joseph was their brother, then he goes ahead and tells them their dreams, and they get jealous and angry. In truth, Joseph was trying to connect to them. Many people are biological brothers and sisters. That doesn't mean necessarily, you may love your brother or sister, doesn't mean you like them. You may share same flesh and blood and genes, doesn't mean that you are close to them. Now, I'm not dismissing the connection of siblings, even if there is no conscious closeness, there's always some deeper connection. But Joseph was working on this, and he wanted to be a friend to them. That's how the Baal Shem Tov says. And therefore, that's what the context of the sheep is here, the sheep and the shepherd. And the fact is that the problem was that the brothers were not ready. They didn't relate it. They didn't reciprocate. But let's just turn the clock forward, just for a while, 2 chapters from now. What happens at the end of the story? Just to show you the context of it all and how it ends up. So you'd think it's going to be a terrible ending, right? Look how it doesn't get worse than this. The brothers then go and almost kill their brother, Joseph. Okay, they don't end up killing him, they throw him in a pit, and they sell him to slavery. And that's it. From that point on, they come back with his blood-stained shirt. His father, Jacob, thinks that he'd been killed by animals. He sits shiva for him for a long time, as the Torah says. He grieves. The brothers don't have no clue what happened to the tribes. They have no clue what happened to Joseph. And that's it. For 22 years, we don't know what happens. 22 years later, a little less maybe than 22 years, the great famine strikes. Now at this point, Joseph had already risen to power in Egypt. But remember, this was a time that there were no fax machines and internet and newspapers. Messages didn't actually get from one place to the other, so one country had no clue what was going on in the other. So Joseph had risen to power, but the great famine forced Jacob and his children to go buy grain in Egypt. So the story, this 20 years later, is they go down to Egypt to get the grain. And there's a whole detailed story. I'm not going to go through all the details right now. What happens? Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him because he was a boy then. He was 17 years old. Now, 20 years later, he's 37. They were all older, so that he was able to recognize them. And through a whole combination of events, ultimately the end of the story, in 2 chapters from now, in Miketz, Vayegash, there's a whole confrontation between Judah and Joseph, and the end of the story is that Joseph no longer can control himself, and he reveals himself to them. He exposes that he is the Joseph. What's their reaction? What would be your reaction? God forbid, if you had sold your brother to slavery and given him up for dead. And suddenly, not only is he alive, but he's also in control of the whole situation, because he was the second in command. He could do whatever he wished. So they're, of course, extremely embarrassed, but they have nowhere to run. And then Joseph says immortal words. And you see how he grew. Not only did he grow here in this chapter, but he continued to grow. Yosef, as I said, from the word Hesafa, to grow. What happens? Joseph says to them, they said, we can't even look at you. We're basically how do you look at yourself, what you've done to your brother? And I'm sure at that point they had many, many regrets. They realized their mistake. But what were they supposed to do? And here they're confronted. And Joseph had all the right to be angry, to even have vengeance. Because that was a criminal thing they did. They sold them into slavery. As a matter of fact, later, 1,000 years later, there'd be a very terrible Roman emperor who would actually kill 10 of the greatest leaders of the Jewish nation. And we tell the story every Yom Kippur, Eila Eskred, Asari Haruge Malchus, the 10 martyrs, including Rabbi Akiva, because the Roman emperor said nobody ever paid back for selling Joseph into slavery. And what does it say in the Torah about kidnapping? As a person who kidnaps someone gets the death penalty. Now that Roman Empire had other intentions in mind. He wasn't suddenly becoming such a just and moral guy. But he found himself a good hook. He found himself a good excuse. And the story there goes that they went up to heaven to ask heaven if there's such a decree. And is he right? And heaven says, yes, he's right, and you have to accept upon yourself this punishment. So we see clearly that what the brothers did was not such a simple thing. It didn't just disappear. 1,000 years later, it would come back to haunt them in one of the worst possible ways. So what does Joseph do instead? And not only does he not show anger, not only does he's not even neutral. He says to them, in Parsha Vayigash, as I said, 2 chapters from now, he says to his brothers, why are you concerned? It's not you that sent me here. It was God that led me to Egypt. In other words, besides the fact that Joseph doesn't personally take what they did, he saw the bigger picture. He realized that he would not be in Egypt today had God not wanted him to be here. And he would never have been in power. And then he tells them, had I not been sold and not been brought here to Egypt, I would not be here now to sustain you and our father, and the entire Jewish nation would have died right there and then. Just think for a moment. What would have happened if Joseph was remained in Israel with his brothers? You think they'd come down to Egypt and suddenly be able to buy grain and be survived? No, it wouldn't have been so simple. Who knows what would have happened? And even had they bought grain, here Joseph, not only did he sustain them, but he also brought them to Egypt, gave them the best of the land, Eretz Goshen, and from there on the Jews thrived. And yes, they would end up being in a great bondage and exile in Egypt, but you know something? Because of that they became a nation. And they were born there as a nation, and became strong, and from there went to receive the Torah, and the rest is history. So when you think about the big picture, yes, it all began with Vayeishev Hurad Mitzrayma. Joseph went down to Egypt. When you look at the small picture of the moment, it's one of the worst possible stories. But when you look at the end of the story, Joseph prevailed. So the friendship that he showed his brothers here in this beginning of this chapter, at that moment they didn't reciprocate, they didn't appreciate, they didn't understand. But 20 years later they did. And it was the same Joseph. He did not ever allow the betrayal that happened to him affect him personally. So though sure he had plenty of reason to be angry, and maybe he had elements of anger inside of him, but he realized there's a bigger story happening here. So you may ask, so what's the lesson to us? Well, the lesson to us is many lessons. But here's the biggest one, psychologically speaking. If you're able to interview Joseph in a therapy session and discuss this whole matter, here's a most important contrast that is critical. When we get hurt in our lives, each of us, so just like there's a certain natural, when you get cut, your finger gets cut, there's a certain natural, your finger bleeds, and then it clots, and then it heals. And the process is a pretty simple one. There's a healing process. And there's a pain involved and so on. When we get hurt, generally emotionally, what usually happens? There are things that happen that are common to all people. Firstly, you get angry at those that hurt you. Secondly, you usually create a worse situation, the secondary situation, than the initial hurt. Because you may look for vengeance. You can get consumed with that person who's hurt you. You know, your whole life you begin to pray and hope that that person gets hurt in return. And all kinds of distorted things can happen to a human being. What ends up happening, in one word, you become a victim. And once you become a victim, it's much, much worse than the initial problem. Because now you have a victim mentality. And a victim mentality creates a whole new psychological set of tools that are distortions and that take control of your life. Now, have you ever been consumed with something? You don't mean being consumed. When you get consumed with something, your whole being, your mind, your heart, just simply can't get over it. And you keep saying, I can't believe that that person did this to me. And especially deep things start lasting and start becoming part of you. And they really reshape your whole identity. So a true deep betrayal, as other wounds, but I'm talking about this one, can create something which is much worse than the betrayal, which is that you become a victim of the betrayal. You see, what Joseph would never happen to him, and here's what he would respond if you shared with him. He did not allow that which happened to him to shape him. It happened to him, but it didn't become him. It's like we may suffer in life, but we don't necessarily have to become sufferers. It's a big difference between the verb and the noun. In other words, you experience something, it doesn't mean you have to become it. People who went through the Holocaust, who had other great, terrible tragedies in their lives. There's a big difference between suffering a tragedy and then becoming a tragic figure. And that's critical because what Joseph's secret was, he had an identity. Nothing could shake his identity. Just because he was mistreated, even in the worst possible ways, his identity did not change because he was mistreated. Because to him that was even worse than the initial being betrayed. Why is it worse? Because it means I no longer have control over myself. The person who hurt me is now in control of my life. And the rest of my life is all shaped by a person who took control. So interestingly, and ironically you can say, initially you think, if you're victimized, you're hurt by somebody. So the first reaction is, yes, somebody has imposed their will and violated you in one way or another. And I'm talking about all levels of abuse, from the most subtle to the most extreme. It's a form of violation. And you're outraged by somebody who violating, somebody taking control. What right do they have to step on your dignity or step on your boundary, cross boundaries and enter into your world? And so you would think that the first reaction to that would be, is that you stop it right there. You nip it in the bud and say, no, that will not be controlled by that person. I am myself. But the interesting thing that happens to many people, especially if it's not nipped in the bud, if it's not caught early, is it's exactly what happens. Your anger and resentment and all the things you develop as a result of that betrayal start shaping your identity. So what you've done is, willingly, allowed that person to be much more controlled than they ever could have been in control. Because the first betrayal, yes, that they were in control. But from here on, you are. And this is one of the hardest things to deal with in a therapeutic environment, is to teach a person that you have to not allow that person to continue to control you. But you justify it by saying, 1 second, that person did that to me, I need to get even, they deserve to be punished, why is the world not supporting me in it, and all that. All the time, you're now in total control of that person, what they did to you. Now, the key thing to remember is that just because you have an identity, that doesn't mean you forget and forgive. See, that mistake many of us has is, well, if I become independent or free of what was done to me, then that person got off, what's the word for it? Scot-free, right. So you say to yourself, I can't let that happen. But what are you doing in return? Say, so I have to continue to carry the anger and resentment. At least that person shouldn't get off scot-free. But they still get off scot-free. Just because you're angry and resentful doesn't mean I'm bitter. Doesn't mean that person isn't free. So the key thing is to know is that discovering yourself and holding on to your own identity, not shaped by what has happened to you, gives you the freedom. That's the first thing. And then what happens to that person? Look, maybe you'll have an opportunity to demand justice, or maybe you won't. Maybe the person will die before you can get something done. But the bottom line is that you have not become an ongoing, perpetual hostage to what happened to you. This is, in essence, the whole story of Joseph. And this is not forced. This is exactly what he said. He said, you didn't do this to me. God led me this way. And it all begins in this few words where Joseph says, that Roya es echav batzayin. As I said, the verse doesn't say Roya batzayin shal echav or im echav. It says clearly, and the Baal Shem Tov interprets, Roya es echav. He was a friend. He tended to his brothers. He was looking for friendship and looking to create a connection with them. Now there are deeper reasons why he wanted a connection. There are mystical reasons and Kabbalistic reasons and messianic reasons. And at the end of Vayigash, actually, that's the story. In Vayigash, the story of the reunion of Joseph and his brothers, and actually the Haftarah of Vayigash talks about Mashiach's times where the Joseph and the other tribes will come together. Because just to round out the story, just for the record, several hundred years later, well, more than several hundred, almost 1,000 years later, there's the story of King David, the first king in Israel, and then King Solomon, and then King Solomon's child rebels against King Solomon, and from there on the kingdom of Israel was split into two. It was called Malchus Beis Yehuda and Malchus Yisrael. Malchus Yehuda, Malchus Yisrael. Judah and Benjamin and part of some other, but mostly Judah and Benjamin became one kingdom, their own kings, and the other tribes had their own king. As a matter of fact, when the temple was destroyed, the temple was in the domain of Judah and Benjamin. But as you may know, the Assyrians and Sancherib first conquered the other tribes. That's why we have 10 lost tribes. You hear the concept of the 10 lost tribes. Why is it 10? Why not 12 lost tribes? Because Sancherib was the king of Assyria, and he conquered that kingdom first, the kingdom of Israel, which was the rest of Israel, not the area around Jerusalem and where Judah and Benjamin controlled. And he basically dispersed them all over the world. It says Sancherib Bilbilas Ha'elam, Sancherib dispersed all the people, and from there on, those tribes got lost. There are many meanings and reasons what means lost. Are they actually lost? Are they somewhere now in some nation that we don't recognize? Are they Chinese? Are they Africans? Who knows? And there's all kinds of interpretations. But the ones that did not get lost are the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. And as a matter of fact, most I would say 99.9% of Jews today originate from either Judah or Benjamin or Levi, because remember, they didn't own any land in Israel. They lived all in Jerusalem as well, so they were also under the domain of Judah and Benjamin. So you have Kohanim today, Levites, and Israelites are mostly from Judah and Benjamin. Maybe part of Manasseh, maybe part of some other tribe, but minority, mostly from those tribes. So what happened with them? What happened with them is a little after Sancherib and Assyria conquered the 10 tribes, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, of Bavel, he conquered Jerusalem. And that's the first destruction of the destruction of the first temple. You know, the second temple was already only the Judah and Benjamin tribes and Levi, no longer the 10 tribes, and that was later destroyed by the Romans. But the split between the two kingdoms is alluded to in the Haftarah of Vayeishev. So you see the split between Joseph and really the rest of the tribes, and Judah and Benjamin, would represent essentially the split among the nation of Israel that goes back from those two kingdoms. And then in the Haftarah, 2 weeks from now, we'll read how when Mashiach comes, he will reunite Vayeishev and Yehuda, that they will become one again. And of course, David, Mashiach coming from the house of David, will rule. But there will be the friendship and unity that Joseph so aspired to. So there's a lot more to talk about this whole unity, but I want to apply it more to our personal lives. I just wanted to round it out because you see from here, it's much more than just Joseph and his brothers. It's a battle that would continue and then ultimately be resolved. But then, in 2 chapters from now, and then again it would come a split in the kingdoms. But at the end of days, there would again be the unity. So, the idea of being a friend, what it comes down to in practical psychological terms, what do we learn from this? So let's go back to our the initial question. Were you ever betrayed? So we've all experienced different betrayals in our lives. Sometimes a subtle form, sometimes very overt. Remember, betrayal doesn't always mean it's intentional on the other person's part. Sometimes life betrays us, circumstances. Things didn't work out exactly as we planned them to. So betrayal is a very broad term. Obviously, it also includes overt and very direct betrayal where somebody abandoned you, someone who promised that they would be there for you or should have been there for you, a parent, a family member, and then something takes place, and it could be money or some other distraction, and a person's just not there for you. The unconditional nurturing that you deserve, that each of us deserves, was not there. This creates maybe one of the deepest wounds, as I mentioned, in the psyche and the soul of a human being. It's very hard to get over that. But here the question is, what happens next? What happens to your life when things don't work exactly as you wanted them to work? So the natural reaction most of us have, as I said, and I'm reiterating, is we end up becoming victims, whether we like it or not. No one's going to admit it because nobody likes to be called a victim. No one's going to call themselves a victim. But that's what happens. that experience ends up shaping you. A simple example, which I'm sure relates to some of you, hopefully it doesn't, but it's inevitable, and something I deal with very often. And just recently, I'm using a case study here, without names. So maybe your story. I apologize if it just happens to be your story. I'm not trying to say something from anyone in this room here or online, but it's inevitable that certain stories happen in many different scenarios. So a person, falls in love with someone, and they, in the real way, and time passes, and it lasts through a period of time. It's not a quick thing, a fling or a crush. It endures. And then, of course, something happens that causes them to split apart. And often it's dealt with a lot of pain involved. And there are different circumstances. I don't want to spell out one particular reason that people would part, but it happens. It happens all the time. And the devastation initial is very profound, because you've been with someone for a while, you love them and they loved you, and then suddenly one day, or maybe it's not one day, maybe over a period of time, it falls apart. And it's hard to believe, because at one moment there was a time where you felt inseparable, and you felt that this was the love of your life. And then circumstances, and it doesn't happen. So there's the initial trauma, the initial impact. I'm not even getting into who initiated it, and who's the cause, whether you're to blame or the other person is to blame. The point is, it happens. Obviously, if you feel that it was not in your control and the other person suddenly disappeared, in a way that even more devastating. If you chose to leave, you probably had a good reason, or maybe not. Again, because it's so common, there's so many different circumstances, not really relevant to circumstances. What I want to address is more what happens next. What happens with your life. So, for many of us, after a while, you get over the initial shock. So like all wounds, it gets covered up, new layers of skin grow, and you move on. But it happens. It's not going away so fast. It doesn't mean necessarily that you continue loving that person or missing them, but the hurt is still there. You would start questioning yourself. What's the matter with it? I was so convinced. I was so sure. So it has to somewhere weaken your resolve. Because next time that you're so sure, you start saying, well, am I really so sure? Look what happened last time I was so sure, and it wasn't so. It didn't end up exactly. And again, I'm not talking about blaming. Maybe you're to blame the other person. It doesn't matter. Bottom line is, the certainty that you once had, maybe the naivete, is no longer there. So what's happening here is that breakup or that experience has to impact your future decisions. Now, in extreme situations, especially if it happens more than once, people start not allowing themselves to become so vulnerable. So they don't let anyone in. And you have that symptom where people start locking themselves up. Yes, they date and they meet people, but there's a part of them they will not let anyone there because they've been hurt too many times and they don't want to go there. Which of course really means that this relationship can never really happen. Because if you're not letting anyone in, obviously you're also not letting anyone out. You're letting yourself out, so you're also not letting yourself in a way. So there's no relationship on that level. So what are you really expecting? To have a relationship on certain levels, but when it gets too deep, I'm not there. Obviously the absurdity of that is obvious, but we still do it because we've been hurt. It's a common thing. It's just like, on a very physical level, if you have a very tender nerve, what happens with tender nerve? Well, let's say a certain nerve in your leg is hurting you. So naturally, you're going to put more pressure on the other leg, or one side of your mouth. So naturally, you're just not going to go there because you don't want to be hurt again. So there's nothing wrong with being afraid to be hurt. But the fact is, when it comes to a leg or a foot or a tooth or whatever, then at some point you hopefully will get over it and it'll go away. But when it comes to relationships, if you stop going there, then really what you're doing is cutting off a part of yourself. But we do that naturally because we don't want to be hurt. And yes, sometimes the fear of being hurt is more powerful than the need for real love. And that's unfortunate. We build up our defenses, and then we hope for the ridiculous, ironic miracle that you'll find someone to love even though you're not opening up that part of yourself. Now, how that could happen is very hard to imagine. I mean, we hope to have maybe a knight in shining armor that will just be able to break through, and you hope for a miracle. But remember, if you're not letting that person there, how could they save you if you don't let them in, so to speak? And secondly, do we really want to be saved? Is that really the goal here, is to have a caretaker? You want to have an equal, reciprocal relationship. So I can go on and on with the symptoms. I'm particularly thinking of one instance, not simply, as I said, as a case study. And what you have here is the typical victim consequences that I'm describing. Now, this person may not call themselves a victim. As I said, calling yourself a victim is not a very complimentary thing to say. I'm a victim. But the fact is, if it walks like a victim and talks like a victim and quacks like a victim, it's a victim. Whether you like the name or not. A victim means that your present decisions are being shaped by previous experience. Tell me how else do you define a victim? So you may not feel like a victim, you may feel very strong, you may feel in other areas of your life you're in all control, but in this area you are haunted by the past. And this is not a critique, and it's not meant to be some type of rebuking someone. It's just a matter of being honest. Now, why did Joseph not have this problem? He was betrayed. He was deeply betrayed. He didn't have this problem because he was a man that was identity was not defined by other people. You see, here's the problem. Let's talk about how you enter into that relationship. If you enter into a relationship, let's say the first one, before you've been hurt, and you enter in saying, oh, now I found the person I love, so now everything is going to be great. So it's almost like saying that person gave you love, and now when they leave, they take away the love, you are no longer a complete human being. But before that relationship, you're also an identity and a human being. You see, in this insecure world, many of us define ourselves by other people. So the truth is, you were a victim before you even met that person. You're just a victim in waiting, so to speak, a potential one. Again, I don't mean to be harsh, I'm just trying to define it. You're a person who was vulnerable enough because you didn't really have an identity. See, Joseph, as I mentioned, came to a level of appreciation that he was an agent of God's in this world. And it comes down to absolutely to faith in God, of course. That God created him with an indispensable role to play, with a divine image. This is long before he encountered his brothers. This is how he felt, period. And when you come with that solid type of identity, that doesn't mean you don't want love. It doesn't mean you don't need love. It just means that nobody can take away anything from you because they didn't give it to you. Your sense of dignity and your identity is not defined by others because they didn't give it to you. But if you don't have that sense of self and you think, oh, I'll love somebody and they'll love me and they're going to give me that identity, then of course, then the moment they take it away, you're now less. So then you could say, so then what does love really do? If I have an identity without the person that I love, I'm not dependent on them. The answer is love is not meant to give you an identity. Love is meant to take your identity and bring you a whole new level of transcendence, dimensions you can never reach on your own. Love is not meant to give you just security to make you feel good that you exist. That you're supposed to have on your own. So it all comes down to how you begin your journey. So the lesson we learn from Joseph, number one is, obviously, this is to preempt all issues would be, you begin with a strong sense of self. So no matter what happens in your life, no one can take away that self. Can you be hurt? Of course you can be hurt. But as I said, your hurt doesn't turn you into a person that is defined by your hurt. In other words, you suffer doesn't mean you're a sufferer. It's an experience. It's like every verb. It's an experience. But it's not your state of being. As soon as it becomes your state of being, you have to say that prior to that experience, you didn't yet have a defined state of being. So that, of course, is the best of all worlds, where you begin your childhood, your life, you grow up in an environment where you have that type of serious sense of self. The question, of course, everyone will ask is, well, what happens if I didn't have that? Joseph was blessed to have that. He had the father, he had a mother, he had a life that cultivated that in him. So yes, when you have that type of strength, a personality, so then no matter what happens to you, even a betrayal by your brothers, does not take away who you are. So he was able to rise above it ultimately, even though it was painful. But what about the rest of us who may grow up in a home or environment where we're not exactly build up that type of security? Well, let's say the betrayal happened when you were very young, before you were able to build up a sense of self. Then what? Well, the answer is, remember, just because you didn't build up a sense of self doesn't mean you don't have it. It just meant it was lying there for you to develop. And that's why it is vital and critical. If you look in the Bible, the first thing of all things that the Torah begins with, in defining a human being, it says the human being was created in divine image. B'Tselem Elokim. And it says it more than once, several times. Now what do you think, why is that so important? Why is that so significant? Most people read it First of all, it's very cryptic. Tselem Elokim, divine image. What does that mean? God imbued us, instilled the soul within us. What does it mean? So let me translate into very simple English. It simply means this, that the bottom line is that each of us, essentially, if you were to cut to the core, to the bone of who you are a piece of God. Which means that you are godly, divine, indispensable. And just as God is eternal, you too have a piece of eternity inside of you. This is irrelevant what kind of home you grew up in. Even if you grew up in a home, the worst possible situation, and I don't even want to describe the worst possible, abusive home, abandonment, a child given away by parents to strangers, a homeless child. I can go on and all the devastation and the tragedies of children who grow up alone. Even that child was put on this earth by God. This is also true, not just of abuse imposed by other human beings, but also true, God forbid, I will talk a situation like a handicapped child, called special child. A child born with the capacities or inability to do certain things. Now, who put that child on this earth? Also God. We may not understand the mysteries of God's ways, why certain children are born healthy and some are not. But there's still that soul of that child does not deserve less respect than any soul. The fact that you and I or other human beings can't deal with it, or because it's not regular, that's our own limitations of our own mortality. We don't understand God's plan. And I'm not saying that it's not a painful situation, not a challenging one. But every soul on this earth deserves the dignity because it's part of the divine image. It is a divine image. This is the essence of the whole Torah. The whole Torah begins with this. And to eliminate this element, and you can take away all the next principles of the Torah, will not have anything to stand on. Everything begins with that. And as a result of that, it means that you matter, you're indispensable, and everything you do matters. Because there's some godly part to it. Now the question now is, how aware are you of it? That's all. If you grew up in a home that was healthy and nurturing, in a home like Joseph's, so he had a sense of self, and it was cultivated, and therefore whatever happened to him, he was able to handle it. The fact that some people grow up in homes where they're betrayed or hurt in ways long before they are able to develop a sense of self still does not mean that their soul disappeared. Who was betrayed in you? A part of you was betrayed. Your soul can never be betrayed by anybody. You know why? Because they didn't give it to you. So they can't betray it. So the challenge that we have to come to discover, and this is the work cut out for us, which is not easy always to do, as adults, is to connect to that place that was never betrayed in the first place. In other words, you have to discover that core sense of self. So again, for those that had environments that helped cultivate it early on, obviously you have the preemptive tools to be resilient enough to deal with many challenges. But even a person who is not given that still has the soul waiting, and the key is to get to that point, to get to the part of the soul that nobody could have hurt because nobody can reach into there. And if you ask me if this is doable, absolutely, I've seen it. I have seen people personally witness the worst circumstances who are able to reach that place. And yes, when they reach there, there's a unbelievable refinement, unparalleled in the human race. You will not find a more refined human being than one who's come through the fire and learned to discover that sense of self. So the lesson from Joseph, above all, is that there is that part inside of all of us. Now here's where it gets even more interesting and more practical in a way. One of the ways, so you could ask, so how do you begin? What do you do? We need some profound surgical therapy here to cut into that essence of your soul, to discover yourself. Well, number one is there are ways to get there, and I'll discuss some of them in a moment. But there's an interesting way. One of the methods and tools is counterintuitive, but when you think about it, you see how precious and powerful it is, this tool. You see, I mentioned before, a person is victimized and hurt by something, betrayed, or hurt in any other way, or life circumstances affect a person. Okay. The key thing is not to allow, it's like stemming the flow. nipping it in the bud. That happened, fine. But from here on, I'm not going to allow that to continue to haunt and victimize me. But we don't usually do that. What we usually do is we feed right into it, and we allow it to affect us. Again, this is not a critique, it's just the way we naturally work. So then the only real solution then is, if you think about it, is you have to do something that counters that. How do you counter, what's the opposite of a victim's attitude to something? Is behaving like you're not a victim, even if you have to fake it. What do the non-victims do? You do what Joseph does. You take initiatives, even though they seem to be counterintuitive. You'd think that Joseph would not extend his friendship to his brothers, knowing that they were jealous of him. And more than that, he took a major risk. He put his own life at risk. He knew that the brothers were jealous. He had just told them their dreams. They were extremely angry, and they went away in that jealousy. Then suddenly, it says like this, Vayikanu esechav aviv Shechem. His brothers were jealous of him. A verse later it says his brothers went out to Shechem to tend to their sheep. And Jacob sends him to his brothers. So forget about Jacob's intentions, which were also pure. He wanted him to reconcile with them. But Joseph understood well, he was a wise person, he understood what's going on. And still he pursues them. And he pursues them in friendship. He wants to find them. And he's going alone. He didn't go with guards. He didn't go with watchdogs. He went on his own. This is the classic non-victim attitude. You do what you think is right. If you're in a situation, and just because you've been hurt, and someone betrayed you, so the natural thing is you're now not going to let anyone else betray you, so you're going to become tougher. You're definitely not going to take initiatives. You're not going to put yourself on the line. But a person who's not a victim is secure enough to show love, even though no love is shown to him or to her. Do you have the courage to do that? That courage comes from the soul that is unaffected by these type of things. So for Joseph it came easier, I guess, or maybe he also had to work at it. But this means that one of the tools to access the part of yourself that transcends and is beyond victim is to do exactly the opposite of what you would naturally do. Which is, if you feel that you want to show love to someone, just because you learn through hard-earned experience that love is not easy in this world, that doesn't mean you shouldn't show it. Does it mean you should be naive and just let anyone in and hurt you? Obviously not. But it means that you do not allow yourself to behave like a victim, where everything is defined by your defenses and by your past experiences. Now this takes work. This takes initiative. That's why the effort of a person to be a giver instead of a taker. A giver, whether it's a charitable person, whether it's financial charity or it's through time or giving to another person, is not easy for most of us. You know why it's not easy? Because we live in an insecure world and we think the only way that we'll have security is by holding on to things. So the more you hold on to, the more you feel you're secure. The most secure people in this world are the people who have no problem giving. You know why? Because by giving away doesn't make them less. Their power is not defined by how much they have or how much they think they have. This is a person who's not a victim. He's not an insecure person defined by a material world that defines everything in terms of how much you own. It's a person who defines things by what he thinks is right. So here you have, the verse goes like this. So Joseph goes out now looking for his brothers. The way Jacob puts it is like this. Go see the Shlem Achicha, the peace of your brothers, where they stand, and how their welfare. Go take care of them. Go help them. And then it says like this. Think of these immortal words, and how relevant they are to us. And a stranger sees him, finds Joseph wandering. And he says to him, Matavakish, what are you looking for? You know, in our lives, each of us, we wander many times. It's called being a lost soul. You are not sure where to go. There are times you know where to go, and times you don't. So you're a wandering person. And you will meet a stranger. A stranger will meet you and say to you, what are you looking for? And the answer Joseph gives is extremely moving when you think about it. He says, I'm looking for my brothers. Now, of course, in a deeper sense, it doesn't just mean he's physically looking for his brother. He's looking for a brother in this world. He's looking for someone that can be a brother, someone that he can love. And he knows his brothers have been alienated, and he knows his brothers are jealous. He's looking for his brothers. And he ends up finding them. But that's not the point here. The point is, from Joseph's perspective, he went searching because he knows that's what he has to do. Ask yourself this question. If you talk to 20 people in your close circle, how many of them would say that they see you as a friend of theirs? And let me explain what it means to be a friend. A friend doesn't just mean that when someone's nice to you, you're nice back to them. And when they're not nice to you, you're not so nice in return. That is, I called it a victim before. That you can call as a follower. You wait for others to take the initiative. A friend is somebody that will take the initiative without waiting for you to ask, without waiting for you to make a move. So how many people would say that you're like that, you're for them, that you are that type of friend in their lives? Not an easy question to ask, because many of us think we are that way. You don't want to maybe have a rude awakening, you're not exactly that way. And maybe the question is the other way around, which I specifically didn't begin with it that way, because I didn't want to be used that way. The other way around is how many people in your life are that way for you? How many people would do that for you? Now that's something easier to dwell on, because I'm sure we can point out how many people don't do it for you. But see, this is the difference. Why I began with the question about ourselves is because that's what a leader does. A person who's not a victim, that's what he does. He doesn't ask how many people are taking care of me. So no one's taking care of me, I have to take care of myself. A true giver asks the question, who can I be a friend to? Where they take an initiative, they don't wait. But we live in a world where we've been trained that, listen, no one's going to take care of you, you better take care of yourself. And I got the raw end of the stick, and enough years, from here on, I'll take care, I'm going to take control. So that's the question that a person should ask themselves. And you'd be surprised the impact and the results if you would try something that you maybe have not tried before. Try to be an unconditional friend to somebody. And I don't just mean randomly, but try that approach. And even consider the possibility that you can be a person like that. This is not meant, again, to criticize anyone. And if you're not that way yet, you could be that way. When you exercise that muscle of being able to initiate something like that, that's your divine image popping its head. So especially those people, as I said earlier, and I saw it from my own experience, I've seen it many times, that those people who suffered greatly in their lives and did not they got the bad set of cards, terrible families, abuse, things that no one even wants to even repeat. When they finally made the moves, and some do and some don't, some remain bitter, some remain broken, some are broken by these experiences, but many are not. The people who are not make the move. When they start taking initiatives, what happens is a part of them that emerges that nobody could ever have imagined, because it was not given to them by their parents. So where's it coming from? It's coming from the part of the soul that is untouched by all the abuse that they endured. And that's an unbelievable power when you're able to access that, because that is you're in control. They say the story about Moses Montefiore. So he was a very wealthy philanthropist from England. You go in Israel, you find a lot of things in the name of Montefiore, especially in Jerusalem. And he rebuilt the old city, the Jewish quarter, and he rebuilt a lot of Jerusalem, a lot of parts in Israel. As a matter of fact, I even discovered one of my visits there. If you go to the old city, there's a lot of cats all over the place. Now, cats are not domestic; they're not the natural domestic animals of Israel. So where the cats come from, I found out Montefiore brought them because there were many rats. Because when the city was in ruins, of course, the rats started coming out. And rats don't like cats, and cats don't like rats. So he imported cats from England and from other places to Israel to get rid of the rats. So the end of my poem was, and now the cats have become the rats. So I don't know what we'll do about the cats, but I don't know. I guess cats are a little more acceptable than rats and rodents, whatever. But there's a lot of cats in the old city, right? You ever see? So that's a little piece of trivia, Jerusalem trivia. Maybe some people there, maybe they'll Gulgulim, they're reincarnations of certain people who like to hang around Jerusalem. Maybe it's Nebuchadnezzar or Titus or who knows. So next time. So here's the story with Montefiore. So he was good friends with Queen Victoria of England, who was considered a very noble and very wise and benevolent queen. And they were associates, friends. He helped fund a lot of the English Empire. And she once asked him, Sir Moses, she said, I'd be interested to know, what's your net worth? What are you worth? He was considered one of the wealthiest people of his time. So it was a strange question, and in those days he said he has to get back to her on that. And so he came back and gave her some figure. I don't know what the exact figure was, but he told her a number. So she looked at him, she says, you mock me, Sir Moses, because I personally know that you have holdings and wealth that's far beyond the number you just said. The amount of property you own, the companies, the wealth, and so on. So he said, no, this is my true value. And she asked him to explain, and he explained. He said, you see, the number that you know, or the things I possess, and that are so-called, that I own, are not really mine. Why they're not mine? Because tomorrow a bad investment, it can go bad. A war could break out. It could be confiscated. Who knows? Things can happen. Unpredictable things. The number I gave you was the amount of money I gave away to charity. The amount of the institutions that I built. That nobody can ever take, because now it's in place, and that's forever mine. So the interesting thing that he said was the true value of what he owned was not what he had, was what he gave away. That's what he owns. And yes, and today, I don't know where Montefiore's physical wealth is. His children, his grandchildren, you can imagine it was probably squandered. There are no Montefiore heirs to the throne. Statistics show in general wealth doesn't last 3 or 4 generations. The greatest wealth either gets destroyed by fights in the family, or just bad investments, or whatever happens to it, or the government and other stuff. So Montefiore said the wisdom, which of course is Jewish wisdom, that what is eternal is only the things that you build, that you give. Money can never be eternal, because money comes and goes, just like food can be eternal. We talk about stories of Joseph and Jacob and Abraham, Sarah. This is thousands of years ago these people lived. No one even knows where their wealth is today. It definitely didn't pass on, because Jews and their grandchildren had to run from one country to the next. But what lives on forever is their spirit, is their identity, is their, what I said earlier, their indispensable sense of self. And they understood that has nothing to do with how much you own and don't own. You own what you give, you own what you build, you own what you leave, the legacy to others. Now, as much as this makes sense to us, don't ever underestimate the pull of the material world that keeps telling you, no, it's all about here and now. It's all about what you acquire now and what you control, because that's how seductive and how hypnotic the material world is. So with all this understanding and all this sense of appreciation, we are real victims of this material world. It takes superhuman effort to get away from that. And I don't just mean in the context of giving. So don't underestimate. So it's true what I said, that every one of us can become givers. Anyone else do not have to be victims, but don't ever underestimate how much work it's going to require. The first thing that's critical is that you have to learn to be able to do the opposite of what you would naturally do. The opposite means that you have to learn to be able to be a friend without waiting for something in return. To the right person, to take that initiative, to have that courage to do that. And it's when you're able to do things like that, that's when breakthroughs happen. That's one of the ways we bring that part of the soul out. Some of us would like to hear, okay, I hear that there's a deeper part of my soul that can never be betrayed. Nobody can take it away from me because no one ever gave it to me. So I'm ready to go into intensive therapy for the next 30 years and discover that part of the soul. We almost like it's almost like a dramatic experience. I'm going to find that pure soul of mine. But meanwhile, for 30 years, you're going to be simply indulging in yourself, because I've been hurt so much in my life. Now I deserve to discover my soul. Well, Judaism says, fine, you want to do a little of that. Introspection is always good, but it's all in action. Behave like a leader, even if you don't feel that way. Behave not like a victim, but like proactively, and then that part of the soul comes out. You'll save 30 years of paying for therapy. This is a little secret here. And you do it behaviorally, consistently. That's why you'll find that people, it says in the Medrash, it says that Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. So these were three great people who withstood a very difficult challenge. They were almost killed for their faith, but they survived one of the greatest challenges. And then the Medrash asks, so what did they do afterwards? You'd think after they've such an achievement, it's like winning the gold medal of Mesiras Nefesh, of self-sacrifice. What did they do afterwards? So the Yalkut says they went and they built families. Simply, something so non-dramatic. You'd think they went to conquer more spiritual heights. What did the Jews do after the Holocaust? Thousands, millions lost entire families, entire cities, communities. Nothing left. Individuals. What did they do? They went and rebuilt families. Now you say, why didn't they think of first getting vengeance on those that killed their children? Or dwelling on it and going to years and years of therapy? They went and built children. They built families. Because they knew that the ultimate solution, and maybe it wasn't even conscious, it was just that instinct, same like Joseph, that we're not going to be victims. We're not going to spend the next 50 years of our lives just remembering a Holocaust. So yes, there's Holocaust Remembrance Days, and we have, but the truth is, the essence of a Jew remembering is building. It's not just about making a day that you dedicate and you light a candle and you can move on, because like Father's Day, like they say Father's Day in Judaism is every day of the year, and so is Mother's Day. It's not she's designated. I'm so busy, so one day of the year I'll give it to my father, buy him a tie, take it to the nursing home, and say I did my duty. Kabbalah Savicha V'Semecha is a mitzvah, is a consistent, continuous mitzvah. Not that it's an easy one, but it's still, that's the mitzvah. So yes, it's nice to remember, but the Jews don't just remember; they act, they do. And the vengeance, the revenge, is the building. Now you run around, you see little Jewish children with tzitzis and payas running around Berlin, and in Munich, and in Linz, and in Vienna. That's the revenge, and not intentionally for the revenge. That's the revenge because it's the building. Now, where do people get such strength? It comes from a place that's called the divine image. It's something that no one could ever destroy. And that's where it comes from. And each of us has it within ourselves. The tragedy, in a way, the irony, I would say, is the prosperity of our times, the comfort zone, in a way does more to conceal the divine image than all the persecution. Because persecution brings out the best in people, sometimes the worst. But in good people, it brings out the best. You know what prosperity does? Prosperity creates zombies, apathy. There's no passion. You're not fighting for anything, not for, not against. It's comfortable. When you're comfortable, it's the worst of all. Now, it's a great blessing to be comfortable, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting to turn the clock back and run from enemies and persecutors, that's not the point. But to turn on the passions and the energy in a comfortable world like ours is very difficult. The comforts that we have are one of the greatest curses in discovering the divine image, because we're not desperate, we're fine. So you have to make yourself desperate. And I mean that in a good way. Not wait for an enemy outside to make you desperate, an enemy within. I'm not going to be a victim, and I'm not going to just continue treading water. I want to get married and build a life and a home and family, and this is a crusade that you have to do in a very desperate way. And until you're not desperate for it, if it's optional things don't happen so easily, especially when they're not easy to achieve in the first place. Optional things, like when everything will be optimal, then I'll do it. Okay, well, good luck. What can I say? I bless you anyway. But I can tell you, in this world, it doesn't happen that way. So we have this lesson of discovering that we have within ourselves a soul that can never be betrayed. And even when parts of you are betrayed, there's still a part of you that remains absolutely intact. And not only intact, but has the power to take the initiative and to be a friend to others. That's what our challenge is. To initiate and proactively initiate a surge of positive energy that creates things. Because when you initiate something, every action has a reaction, every cause has an effect. If you just wait for someone else to act, then you are a victim. Then you are just reacting to things and are not initiating any new energy. It's a challenge, but that's the lesson that we take and we learn from Joseph. So, Each of us have our wounds, each of us have our challenges. But there's a part in each of us, inside each one of us, that remains intact, that remains above it all. And it's revealed when you do something, when you do something kind to another person, even though they didn't do anything to you. You know, Joseph is the ultimate roya, the ultimate shepherd. And as I said, shepherd, the roya in Hebrew comes also from the word friend. That friend, to be able to just be there for somebody unconditionally. And knowing very well that you wander in the fields, and you're looking for your brother, you're looking for your brothers, you're looking for your sisters, you're looking for your friends, but you don't stop looking. And he paid a heavy price for that search. But at the end of the day, he prevailed, not his brothers. He prevailed. He's the one that rose to leadership, and he's the one that ends up sustaining them all, and ends up leading the Jewish people to the next stage of their lives. But the interesting thing is, it says at the end of days, it won't be Joseph that will be the top, it will be Judah. It'll be the house of David. But Joseph will be united with that because he was a key element in being a friend. If Joseph had not initiated friendship to Judah and to the other brothers, we would never have the second half of the story. So you never know the power of somebody taking the first step, making the first move. So what I challenge you all is to make a move and not wait for somebody to invite you or somebody to even challenge you, for that matter. I had to do it that way. I mean, I have no choice, but to make a move, and you'll be surprised what kind of moves will come in return. Now, your fears, trust me, will take over, even though you may be inspired for a moment. So that's going to be your war, your battle, to get over the fear. And that's why we're here for each other. Each of us try to help the other to monitor and not allow the fears to be the controlling force in our lives. But think of it in very stark terms. Some things are gray, some things are have nuances. Here, maybe it's good to put it in very stark and blatant terms. It's your future. So you're either going to make a move or you're not. And each of those, and that choice has consequences. There's no in between. There's no like if, maybe. It's either this or that. It's true, there's a cartoon where the guy comes, a pollster comes to the door and says to the guy, so yes or no? So he says, I think I'm from the undecided. Put me in the undecided, you know. So obviously that option is not going to get you too far. So there's a yes or no. You don't have to answer to me. Mobilize yourself. But this is the challenge of our times. And all the comforts and our gadgets and distractions, whether it's an internet or the friends on Facebook or television or the other things we're addicted to, are not necessarily your real friends. Let's put it this way: they are good. They're good crutches, and they're maybe they medicate you and numb part of the pain, some form of temporary relief. But they're definitely not initiating anything. When you watch a television show, the screen is initiating feelings in you. You're not doing it the other way around. I know some are looking forward to the interactive age where you can speak back to the characters on the screen. But we're not there yet, first of all. And even when we'll be, that's not exactly what we're talking about. So remember that your senses are being stimulated by others all the time. Maybe it's time to start doing the stimulating. So, with that being said, I wish everybody a very illuminating week. It's a week that goes into Hanukkah. Next Wednesday night will be Hanukkah. Correct? We will have the class, yes. Hanukkah style class. And tomorrow night Philip is not giving his class because he's away for Thanksgiving. Turkey season. How many people actually eat turkey anyway? It's just symbolic. Well, and what else can I say? I think I said it all for the evening. But I will say that please see me and everyone at the Meaningful Life Center as your friends in the real way. And we all should try to initiate. Velvo, my colleague and friend, sitting at the door, is here to help. If anybody would like to help sponsor some class, now the end of the year, we're asking for sponsorships. It's a good time to dedicate. We have a few sponsorship opportunities. We have a book to print, interesting book on the ethics of the fathers, and some other things. So if anyone's interested in helping us in that way, please initiate and reach out to us. I'll do my part of initiating as well, but it's always best to hear from people before you hear from me. And again, if you haven't given us your email address, please give that. What we do is I send out a weekly email thought as well as reminders of the themes and topics of this class. And we'll be here next Wednesday night. I mentioned the dedication, I'll say it again. So the class is dedicated firstly in honor of the first wedding anniversary of our good friends Michelle and Steve Lazarus, and fast and complete recovery of his mother, Eleanor, and as well to Mark Belinsky in honor of his uncle, great uncle, Yartzeit, Alter Ben Moshe, 23rd of Kislev, and in honor of Yutzes Kislev. So everyone have a very pleasant week, and hope that you take my words to heart. Words from the heart enter the heart, and we should see our divine images shine and illuminate and warm the world around us. Have a good night. Thank you.